a panel which I'll introduce in a second here. We do want to talk about small cells as a whole, from femto, picos, etc. I know there were some questions yesterday about exactly what is a small cell, and we can certainly get into that. But we've got a great panel here, and I would encourage you to think of questions as we go through this. Again, as we did yesterday, Tracy Ford will be paying money for every question that is asked. Real money in the form of a check in the mail. So, and she promises me it will happen. So, but seriously, this is a good opportunity. The goal of the panel here, we're not trying to, the goal is not to convince everybody that DAS is part of a small cell architecture. It is. But rather to talk about the rest of the architecture as a whole and everything that falls within that. Okay? So with that, I'll tell you quickly, introduce myself. As you may know, my name is Iain Gillott. I run a company called IGR. We do wireless research. We do a lot of actually small cell research. I'm going to show you a few slides in a second just to kind of kick things off. We've been here for a few days, and we say we do a lot of different things. I'll introduce the three folks on the panel, and then I'm going to kick off with a couple of different slides, and I'll ask them to spend a little time on each talking about their view of small cells, and then we'll open up for questions. Okay? So first is Chris Ebert from Nokia Siemens, and Chris gets the award for the longest title known to man. I would read it, but we've only got an hour. So, head of, he actually just said everybody's a head at Nokia Siemens, so he's the head of lettuce. So I like that one. But as you can see, I think of Chris as he's the HetNet 4G guy at Nokia Siemens. When I have questions on all that stuff, I go to Chris at Nokia Siemens. Tony Lefebvre is, he's got a long title as well. In fact, I think his is longer than Chris's. I think, but your company name is slightly shorter. So, outdoor wireless products, wireless business for TE connectivity. And then Matt from Commscope, he's got a smaller title. But Matt's based in Dallas with the Commscope group there, so that fast 3 times. So I'll kick it off and then ask them each to introduce what they do, etc., and we'll go from there. So I'm going to start with, and I'm very mindful of the fact that at the back of the room it's really hard to see some of these charts in the last few days. So all you've got to look at is that red line. It goes up, and it goes up a lot. This is the scare the crap out of you chart, because this is what you've got to deliver in the next 3 or 4 years as an industry to my children. Not my wife, my kids. And basically, this is the US consumption for bandwidth. This is our forecast. But this is in gigabytes per pop per month. Okay? And in 11, it was the average usage in the network was about 250 megs a month. That's not too bad, relatively. There are people like my wife probably doing 100 megs a month. There are people like me doing a couple of gigs a month. The heavy user is about 2.5 gigs a month in 11. 2012, the average doubles to 0.5 meg a month per person. And by the way, this is all on the macro network. There's no Wi-Fi in this. This is not including Wi-Fi offload. If you want to include that, just triple everything on the chart. Now the bad news. You get up to 2016, which is a very short 4 years away, and we are up to an average of just shy of 2.5 gigs per pop per month. The peak, the big users, the main users, the people running around with a laptop and a phone and a tablet, like me, will be doing about 8 gigs a month by that point. But the average is over 2 gigs a month. So the average within 5 years actually goes up by, I think it's 9.5 times. Okay? That's the bad news. And by the way, one more thing. I used to get this question. Does LTE drive the demand for bandwidth? Or does the demand for bandwidth actually drive the adoption of LTE? And the answer is yes. It's chicken and egg. We can argue all day long about, do you put LTE in to meet the demand for bandwidth? Or is the availability of LTE going to drive the demand for bandwidth? And the answer is yes to both. You've got two very big chicken, well, one big chicken and one very big egg, and you guys can decide which one is which. So, and come on. There we go. All right, another hard chart to read from the back, but it's the Himalaya chart. When is bandwidth used? And it is not used equally throughout the day. You get in the car in the morning, you drive to work and watch a video. No. You get in the morning, you get up in the morning, you do some stuff, you go to work. You get to work, you hit the Wi-Fi network or your desktop or whatever. At lunch, you go get a sandwich, maybe sit in the park, watch a video, do some web surfing, whatever you're doing. And you go back to the office in the afternoon, you go home, etc., etc. So we've done a lot of work on mapping out the usage throughout the day, and the scale on the bottom here is from 8 a.m. until midnight. And there's two lines, red and blue, and I'll tell you those in a second. But basically what you get are these three peaks during the day. This is data usage. Voice usage used to look very, very similar to this. The data's a little bit peakier. The blue line, which is the lower line, is for 2011. The red line, which is higher, is for 2016. And you say, well, why is there a different shape? Why are more people using data more at certain times? You get bigger peaks and lower valleys. And the reason is, it's this sit, browse, view. You look at the new devices, they encourage you to take the device, sit down, and do something, right? I haven't seen many people jogging through the park with an iPad strapped to their arm. Okay? I'm sure somebody will do it at one point, but not regularly. Usually you take an iPad, you sit down, and you do something. So the newer devices are actually encouraging people to stay stationary and sit and consume bandwidth. So the peaks get higher. Okay? Now, and this is, okay, so you say, great, this is good, I get all this. Okay, now as we get a little bit complicated. The macro network can deal with so much bandwidth. They are designed by you to deal with an average load, then some peak loading, right? So that we don't have too many problems. What we've done is model, and this is overall for the industry, we actually modeled the capacity and then the demands on it. And you start to see that these three peaks are where the macro network cannot deal with the traffic. There is not enough capacity to deal with those three peaks. And actually the scale on this is percentages. It's 2.5%, 3% over capacity. It's not huge. It's not a huge problem when you look at it like this. The blue line, if you can see it, is the smaller one. That's 2011. The orange is 2016. The problem gets worse. Not only do the peaks get higher where we can't deal with the traffic demand, the base gets wider. There are more times during the day in 2016 where the demand will exceed the capacity on the macro network. Okay? So we have to do something. And again, why? Well, it's more video, 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 video. If you want somebody who should fund all of this development, by the way, YouTube. Any other questions? Right, good. Spectrum issues, YouTube, go get the spectrum for us, please. Okay, so last chart, then we'll open up, I'll hand over to the panel here. So that one, previous one was in overall, look at the overall network of the peaks and valleys. But there's a problem. I said that was for the overall network. That was the average. Well, you don't have averages because people move. So during, like, for example, I know Chris lives up in North Atlanta, and he drove from his house to here today. And we're all sitting here, 300 of us in this room, consuming bandwidth. And we'll all run outside and get our smartphones at the break and make phone calls and check email. And the bandwidth demand here will spike, okay? Because we've all congregated in one space. Think of it this way. The average house in the US is like 2,200 square feet, and it's got about 4 people in it, 4 point something people. Go to your office, look around in Cubeland. In the same area you have in a house, there's probably 10 people, or 12, or 15. So we've compressed everybody into smaller spaces at certain times during the day when they go to work. Therefore, the bandwidth demands also compress. We create hotspots. We create what we call pain points. So these are the pain points throughout the day, from 8 a.m. until midnight. And the pain points in 2011 are not too bad. In 2012, they're about twice as high. It's not too bad. In 2016, there are pain points on this chart that are 16 times bigger than they were in 2011. But they only last for a little while. They only last for an hour or two in the middle of the day in certain places in a geography. We've actually got a project right now taking this model and actually applying it to 8, 9 metro markets to work out when the capacity hits peak and we can't deal with it, and when we have to start deploying small cells based on this model. So there's a lot of spreadsheets behind this. I'm just showing you the end result. So this is why we have small cells. This chart says I can't deal with the demands at this location at this time. I can't deal with it with my macro network. I got to have another solution. I'm going to drop a small cell in there, or 2 or 3 or 10 or 15, and go from there. It doesn't say replace the macro network with a whole new small cell architecture. It says let's supplant what's out there to deal with these demands on the bandwidth. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go back here. Chris, if you want to start. So what I asked the panelists is to introduce themselves, tell me what they do, and basically how they look at the small cell from their perspective, and how they see the development and play. Take 5-7 minutes each or so, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Okay? Chris, if you want to start?
Sure, be happy to. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us today. As Iain's already pointed out, my name is Chris Ebert, and what I really do is I focus on our strategic product marketing for the network. And that's really looking at where are things not only today, but where are they going to be 12, 18, 24 months and beyond in the future. And from a perspective of in-building wireless and DAS, we really see it as being part of a whole. And it's this movement towards unified and SON-enabled heterogeneous networks, which is another big mouthful that sounds like a bad title as well. But what I think I'll try to do today is really just give you some insights into what we see in terms of the innovations in the radio access networks, both macro and small cells, and how that relates and works together within building services to address this capacity. And ironically, a lot of Iain's work mirrored a lot of the work we did. Our projections are a little different. Years ago, we came out with a projection of 5 billion users connected. And when we launched our liquid radio portfolio at CTIA last year, we changed that. It might have been easy to just add a 0 and say 50 billion users connected. But rather what we came up with was that we can actually see entire classes of devices using 1 gigabyte per day in the next few years. And video is often cited, and I think everyone here understands the Netflix effect on the internet. But I'm just going to offer thoughts here for discussions and Q&A. But what we also see is new generations are consuming video much differently. In fact, the average younger person today doesn't even make voice calls. They text, and when they sit down, they do peer-to-peer video. In fact, I was at a friend's house, and her daughter came in and was tugging on her arm and tugging on mine. Look, my friend, and showing a video chat. This is a 9-year-old girl doing a video chat. So another thing to keep in mind is not just the amount of data that's being downloaded, but really peer-to-peer. And what that really led us to is, our liquid networks and liquid radio portfolio. And what I want to offer to you is some thoughts in terms of how we see the networks changing. First and foremost, the networks need to become self-aware and self-adapting. And by that I mean that, it's not just the load presented to the network, but it's the type of load presented to the network and how the network can address that. That we see in the very near future that in core, even in radio, that you'll be moving to more off-the-shelf hardware and fully software-defined networks. Because when you can get to the point where the functionality offered in the network is via software, it makes it tremendously more flexible to allow that network to adapt. And that when you do that, you have to think about the interlinkages. And that's one of the things that I'm going to highlight in the small cells here in a second of what I mean by the interlinkage. But you just don't have address a problem in one part of the network and not think about how it flows all the way through. And then finally, it has to be evolutionary. It has to build on the good work that we're doing in building services today and adding small cells and deploying LTE and the like. But that if you're doing it right and you're really thinking forward, you're thinking through the issues so that the network itself and spectrum assets are planned together. And historically, some of the engineering work could have been done in a little different ways, but not in today's world. When you think about this multi-radio reality that we have 2G systems that are being maintained or upgraded. We have 3G in all different varieties, and we have LTE and even soon LTE Advanced. That's a lot of complexity in the network that's all taking place at the same time people are moving around, or that ebb and flow happens. And when you think about that end user, the end user, one of the things we forget often is when you look at your phone, signal quality doesn't equal throughput. I think you've probably all seen that. You have 5 bars and you think, gee, I don't have very good throughput. And you can have 1 bar and have great throughput. And that's something that's very central to what you're doing in the in-building services. And so it's what solutions you deploy, where, when, and how do you deploy them to complement in-building services with small cells and the like. And by the way, Wi-Fi, a little note on Wi-Fi. For years, Wi-Fi has always been sort of like the third arm. And now Wi-Fi is really becoming one of the 5 fingers. I'll let you decide which finger you want Wi-Fi to be with 2G and 3G, but so it's really about not just offloading, but integrating that Wi-Fi bandwidth. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned, your network and spectrum has to be planned. You have to think about automation. One of the chief operating officers of a major European carrier recently made the point. He said the networks are becoming so complex, we physically can't put enough people at it to deal with it. And so you have to have a software-defined network that is in fact automated in the way it addresses this ebb and flow of users. And another good point made by a CTO is, at the end of the day, we've got to have a good return on investment, because otherwise we're going to spend ourselves out of business trying to deliver coverage and capacity to folks. So let's talk just a little bit. Small cells, Iain's is anything that's not nailed to a post. Ours is a little different. So when you think of a heterogeneous network, it's having multiple layers where you used to just have traditional macro sites. And macro sites will always have a very key role, and they'll need to be understood as you have people going in and out of big buildings. But for us, small cells is kind of that combination of lower wattage sites, so 1 watt, 5 watts, working together with femto in home or enterprise, and Wi-Fi, and doing so in a way that they're deployed with a little bit of a strategery in mind, so that they complement and they don't interfere. So 3 really interesting innovations for you to think about. We launched our active antenna system at CTIA as part of Liquid Radio last year at CTIA. It's now deployed in multiple carriers. And so we decided we couldn't do pictures, so I'm going to do my best to explain a few concepts to you. In the active antenna, what that means is it's not that you just have a little box and you have RF and your antenna system in the same box and so forth. What I'm referring to is actually fully dynamic software-defined beamforming. And what that enables us to do is use the same infrastructure that's on a cell site, and where there was one cell before, there's now two. And it's multi-radio, so one could be propagated via software with beams that are steered, LTE, another one 3G. You can layer these as you add, say, an LTE, more 5 megahertz of spectrum. And what we've seen is that macro site has a 65% increase in capacity and a 20% increase in throughput. And this is from real carrier studies. And why is that? It's because those heavy users, you can steer the beam directly to where they are. And you also can even adjust things like the radiation loads that have been very difficult. So now what you can put up on using existing infrastructure on a tower is something that, weighs about 35 kilograms and a volume about 50 liters. You don't have to drive all over the city and retest. You don't have motors up on the site. You don't have to get a socket wrench and adjust the tilt because there's a new in-building wireless system put in. It actually self-adapts via software. The other thing that I want you to understand is that when you think about the architectures of wireless networks, you've had our traditional distributed RAN architectures that have been here, and we know and love them since day one. And that's a build-to-peak model. That means you put a macro site up and you built it for whatever that peak is, but a lot of times people move, so that capacity is unused. And what we've seen is at any time, up to 80% of the baseband capacity is underutilized. And so there's a new type of architecture, and it's called centralized RAN, or CRAN. It's based off of something that functionality that is known as baseband pooling. And what we're doing in Korea, in Japan, and several parts of the world today is actually allow that baseband unit that was sitting at a site over here, let's say the water bottle, and everybody's by this water bottle, but then they move over here. That baseband unit can actually compensate and help that site out over there, and at night help it out over here as well. Traditionally, that's taken fiber. We've now demonstrated that we can actually do an LTE advanced coordinated multi-point feature, which just turns bad signals into good. And so in LTE, you have a frequency reuse of 1, so it's the same spectrum. If you're in the middle, you have interference. We've actually now demonstrated that we can do that over Ethernet. And finally, on the SON part, all of this can be controlled by software. Those beamforms that I talked about, so say you have a stadium that you're doing in-building services for, you can steer the beams while people are having brats and beer outside, steer the beam in, but you can use the macro site to complement your in-building services. Same with the baseband pooling. And finally, I'll give you an example of a very interesting new small cell technology that we launched just recently at Mobile World Congress. It's a 1-watt technology. It's called our Flexi Zone. And again, if centralized architectures are about allowing one point where baseband processing can be done, this is a 1-watt box about this big. You can have up to 100 of them, and we're moving towards 1,000 that use Wi-Fi mesh or AWS mesh technology. So as long as you have power, you hang them on a street pole, you can put them in a stadium, and they will self-configure and self-connect. If there's Wi-Fi interference, for some reason somebody does something, they'll compensate for each other. And in an in-building scenario, they can be connected via Ethernet on each floor of a building. It's another solution that's all part of the whole. It's not going to change the importance of active DAS and in-building services, but it's again about having a network that's heterogeneous at multiple layers, that's SON, or self-organizing network software enabled, that responds to the users as they move around, as Iain so well pointed out. And so hopefully without charts, I did my best at explaining that, and I'll pass it on to one of my colleagues.
Thanks. So fair warning, I'm always looking for new acronyms. So BSB, beer steered beam, right? We're now going to steer the beams based on the beer demand at stadiums. You will see a newsletter on this tomorrow. Tony.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm Tony Lefebvre with TE Connectivity. We at TE Connectivity have been in the DAS business for many, many years, so this may have more of a DAS-centric, though we will talk about the small cell. But being in this for years, we really like to look at DAS as being the original small cell. And so, our view on a small cell is really what you've heard a lot of the other speakers talk about over the day. It's a smaller radiating a point to address capacity and spectral issues. So, you heard our carrier partners talk about their need for spectrum or lack of spectrum. And we've heard significantly from Iain, and you've seen the charts, the data bandwidth is through the roof. And so what you really need to do is draw down the size of that cell so that you adequately address the population within that cell. Now, what we have found with this experience, that could be a higher power. That could be 20 watts, could be considered a small cell, if the number of users you have per carrier are significant. So when you look at a DAS system and the creation of a small cell, it may be high power, but that power is spread among multiple carriers being your HSPA, your WCDMA, operating carriers, or it could be over multiple operators within that cell. So when we look at some of the deployments we have done, you could go into a stadium and you have 12 to 16 sectors of capacity in a sports venue. And to be able to deliver that to the multiple of users, and users are, I'm sure our carriers would like them to all be on the one carrier, but the reality is there's multiple operators out there, and each of those operators are operating at multiple technologies. And so really when you look at the creation of the small cell, you have to factor all that in. And so really when I look at a small cell, I don't think of it necessarily as a power limit or a power output. It's really the creation of that cell to cover adequately the capacity needs of that population. Now, a lot of the lessons that we learn in deploying these small cells, we've been doing this for years, but we would originally take what many would consider a macro cell or high power or what have you. And we're going to distribute that, and we're going to create smaller cells within venues, within the macro environment at street level with street level DAS. And now we're going to take that and share that capacity over multiple antenna points or multiple small cells. Or we can plan it such that if you need to have more capacity in a given cell, you can allocate that power or power per carrier to that cell and add additional capacity at more of a centralized space, such as a base station hotel. So, over the years of doing this, we've learned that, and I think you've heard it throughout this conference, change is certain. So there will be change happening. We're going from 2G, 3G, 4G. There's going to be 5G, 6G, 7G. And we're taking those lessons and we're saying it's crazy. We cannot keep upgrading our networks and our venues and so forth every 2 years. So really when you look at more of a modern DAS and the approach we're taking is these are multi-band, multi-operator systems. We have them designed for growth because there are things that we can anticipate. So you can anticipate that more power per carrier may be needed. You can anticipate the addition of carriers. You can anticipate the need for spectral swaps. But, you may not be able to anticipate what new frequencies may be auctioned, et cetera. So in a more of a modern DAS system, even at the antenna site, we make provisions that we can accommodate the known changes, but we can also make provisions as best we can to accommodate the unknown. The other thing that we really found as we go into these venues, so you can imagine a big sports venue, real estate's a premium. So if you look at a cell, or if you even look at the facilities at this stadium to support this, it gets quite daunting. When you look at the multitude of technologies that need to be delivered to these small cells, when you look at the number of operators in these public venues that need to be delivered to each of these small cells, if you look at more of a traditional picocell, femtocell, microcell, you name it cell, having those multitude of technologies and operator services at each of these small cell sites, you run out of real estate. And so really a lot of the modern DAS systems take that into account and use high-speed optics or optical aggregation and multiplexing so that you can deliver from existing sites, or you can deliver from more economically advantageous sites, base station hotels, and deliver that over fiber optics, over single fibers to these venues so that, again, you don't run into that real estate crunch at the cell itself or within the venue itself. So, it's our view on that small cell is that it's just that you're creating that small cell, which is a coverage area to cover a certain level of population. And we believe that you need the flexibility to accommodate multiple operators, multiple protocols, multiple carriers, and be able to make that change remotely without having every 2, I think we heard, or 3 years, having to do forklift upgrades at every one of those small cell sites. So that centralized ability, the connected network, being able to unlock that coverage from the capacity, those are all central tenets, and we really see DAS as a single RAN delivery. Now, DAS is very complementary to a picocell, a microcell, femtocell, from that baseband product. We don't create the baseband. That will always continue to be produced by our partners such as NSN. But when you really think about it, in a small cell network, you have the baseband resource, or the capacity, if you will, and you have the RAN. And really what we see when you deliver or create a small cell and you use DAS as that RAN device, you can now very efficiently manage that baseband resource, not only for, say, NSN and their constituents, but also any other constituents that need to get delivery to that cell. And in addition, what we see with an emerging next generation DAS is the ability to accommodate Wi-Fi. So we're in very much agreement that Wi-Fi is part of the mix. We also agree that distributing Wi-Fi over a more traditional DAS does not work. It's not like a mobile protocol. But making provisions for Ethernet access to each of these small cell points is very important as well, so that you can not only accommodate your mobile protocols, but in addition your Wi-Fi protocols as well.
Thanks. So I should, you talked about the known knowns and the unknown knowns and the known unknowns, right? I saw a presentation once by this guy who did a whole presentation talking about wireless technology based on Donald Rumsfeld's sayings. And he started each slide with one of the quotes from Donald Rumsfeld from that famous press conference he gave. So we should really thank Donald Rumsfeld for giving us all this ammunition to talk about wireless networks, because he really helped us out. It's all those years ago, and you're still referencing. So
There you go.
there you go. We did well. Matt?
Thanks. I'll speak a little bit about what Commscope's initiatives are related to small cell and more in particular to deliver high capacity. For those of you that may not be familiar with Commscope, we're a solution provider for both the wireless and wireless infrastructure. We're organized into 3 segments. The first segment is the enterprise segment, who supplies structured cabling and wireless solutions to the various enterprise verticals. The next segment is our broadband segment that addresses primarily the mobile cable television companies. And then the last segment, for those of you probably are more familiar with the name Andrew, that's comprised of, most of that is a legacy Andrew business, and that we're responsible for providing basically the whole complete RF path. I reside in that organization. My organization is the Distributed Coverage Capacity Solutions, previously named Wireless Innovations Group. Our charter is to provide coverage and capacity solutions. Our products range from radiating cables, passive devices, low, medium, and high power off-air and optical repeaters. Basically play in the same space that Tony plays in. So what is it from Commscope's perspective? I mean, we try not to lose sight of the fact that small cells is a way of trying to meet the capacity demands. And so we look at it kind of in a broader scope. Number one is what's the best way? What is small cell? It's really a way to increase the number of sector density. So we look at it in two folds. How can we maximize capacity in the current deployments that are done today? And then how do we address the small cell market? So one way in the antenna state, it's all about RF containment, trying to be able to contain the energy to a particular area. So we have development goes on to increase sector counts for macro sites, because that is still one underutilized way to increase capacity that can be done today. Within the small cell area, there are several challenges. I mean, to me, I came into the wireless space in the 1990s, and about the mid-1990s, there was a lot of talk about overlay, underlay networks, micro and pico, micro and macro cell sites. And a lot of the small cell stuff, to me, is reminiscent of a lot of the dialogue that went on back in that time period. And the challenges that were faced then, I think, are the same challenges we face today. And I break them down into the availability and cost of backhaul and power. As we increase the number of nodes, we increase the demand for backhaul. The second thing is site acquisition cost and access cost. Will they scale? Because if they don't scale in terms of the volume, if the prices stay as what they are today, it won't matter whether the equipment is free. Small cell will be too expensive. The third component is interference control, and that comes back to RF containment. It comes back to SON. I mean, SON has to live up to the hype for small cells to be successful. The overall impact of management and overhead. I mean, we're talking about, some forecasts have by 2017, 70 million small cells. We've amassed, several million in the last 3 decades. So we're talking about going from several million cells to 70 million cells, and that all has to be managed, and managed communication has to be accomplished between these nodes for interference control to work. So those are the challenges. And then equipment reliability, because the equipment reliability has to scale with the number. If it stays at a typical node, then that's a problem. So when we look at it, small cells, we're trying to figure out how to solve those challenges in each one of those areas. From a DAS perspective, which I'm more comfortable in speaking to, we're investing heavily into the development of more intelligent, more efficient, multi-operator, multi-technology platforms. Applications like Chris spoke, are going to really take off and address a single operator solution. For places for companies like Commscope and Tony's company, I think the future for us is in the multi-operator, multi-technology platforms. So we're investing on how to make those platforms easier and quicker to deploy. The focuses are simple to design, simple to order, simple to field. Have more plug-and-play like functionality, a lot of the features that Son talks about, having that be the same thing, to have it. I liken it to when you had to add a peripheral to your computer 5-6 years ago, and all the heartache that you had to go through, and today where you can plug it in and it auto-discovers and it goes off and looks at drivers. That's where DAS needs to move towards. It needs to move from the old days to this plug-and-play functionality. It needs to be self-aware. It needs to be aware of what the environment is. It needs to be, and the environment is not just external signals and external interference, but the passive infrastructure that goes with it, the BTS inputs that go with it. And it's got to be simple to change and flexible to do for the future. So that's the areas that, from my particular division, that we're focused on trying to solve. And to Tony's point, having these systems be able to cater to all these operators so that you don't have to come back into a venue to add additional operators, to add additional technologies. When we do this, I've talked to many of the CTO offices, and they refer to DAS as a big dumb pipe. And to a large extent, that's partially true. But one of the benefits of being a big dumb pipe is you don't really care about what the technology is that's going through it. And that's one of the true benefits of DAS. And so we see the marriage of taking some of these other functionalities, putting them together with a technology agnostic pipe, brings a lot of value for the DAS in these hotspot venues. The other areas in the small cell things we're attacking are also active antennas as well, so that we can do adaptive beam steering. We're looking at fuel cell solutions to meet the technology backhaul, to meet the power requirements. We're looking at backhaul solutions because all this communication that's needed, all this backhaul that's needed, is putting a tremendous demand on that. We're looking at ways to field and deploy these systems quickly and rapidly as well. So that's basically just a summary of kind of where we see where we're going as a company.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, questions? Tracy sent me a text. She's now up to $20 per question. No? Wow. Guess I get the money then. All three of you mentioned SON, self-optimizing networks, in various different forms. And the interesting thing when I look at SON is not one thing. It's a collection of tools in a toolkit, and it can be many different things to different people. But I think you all said at some point we need it. It's critical. So from what perspective do you see SON, and maybe Matt, start with you, how do you see SON playing into your world? What's it going to give you, and which part of it specifically do you want or need?
Well, I think, so basically SON is there to address several different factors. One is the plug and play, but the one that I want to focus on is the interference control and mitigation for small cells to work. I mean, one of the problems, the challenges we see in a stadium is how fine you can sectorize a cell. I mean, in some cases they're talking about having a sector for 2,500 people. And RF containment is part of that. That's what you're going to see in small cell, is how do you contain the footprint, and how do you adjust powers and such. So smart antennas will be part of that problem, but SON is a piece that's really going to be critical for that to happen. The communication, some of the challenges of SON, particularly when you start moving to a multi-vendor platform, is how do you have that communication? I mean, there's communication between the OEMs is not, I don't think any of them are embrace that. Most of them are pulling out of the inner working groups. So that remains a key challenge. I think when you operate within one vendor's community, cell site community, it's a workable solution. As you start to do in bordering between one vendor to another vendor, there's a lot of interaction. And we look at it from a DAS standpoint. How do we prepare ourselves to work in that space? And that's by having more information about what's going on outside the network, so we can communicate that back in hopes that there's cooperation. We'll have the same challenges as an NSN system interfacing next door to an Ericsson system. But we're trying to position ourselves to be able to provide that information back about what we see in the environment, and then having the ability to make changes to our network upon direction.
So for self-organizing networks, I mean, there's really two concepts. I talked about the network needing to be self-aware and self-adaptive. The first, when we think about it, we think about two of them working together. One is what we call our intelligent broadband management. And that's, again, about understanding the type of load presented to the network and adapting that content so it can be served where whatever in building or small cell environment there is. And then, when you shorthand for SON, since all the politicians seem to be saying shorthand for everything these days, is just automation, right? And so for us, it's about really thinking through that interference between the different layers, between the macro layer, between micro, pico in building solutions. That's why I mentioned, for instance, like with the active antenna system, it can adapt itself by time of day or by load, by automating the ability to steer those beams. The other thing that's really important too is it's one thing, interference is one part of it, but the other part of it is the handover between the layers. And that is extremely important, so that when users, all a user really wants is the connection. They want it to be seamless. So when you're building that automation capability, you need to think through that. And what's really important for carriers today is traffic shaping. And so if you haven't heard the traffic shaping toolkit word, it's really about understanding the traffic that's flowing between the different layers and keeping the right users on the right technology. Which one should be on 3G, which one should be on LTE, maybe some just can be put to 2G voice because they're not doing a lot of data, and don't keep them on a different radio technology. And at the end of the day, that all has to kind of work together, and that's why it is complex. And that's why it's not something you can just throw a ton of people at the problem. But the good news is that the more we move to this sort of intelligent or cognitive network capability, the easier that will make our life, and the better the end user experience.
Yeah, it's always been kind of the nirvana of DAS is this time of day type management. So when you really look at a network, and you're going to have idle times. So, your central business district is going to be busy during one time, probably not at the same time that everybody's going to be watching a football game, probably not the same time they're commuting on the freeway. So having this concept of being able to move capacity rather than having a lot of idle resources has always been kind of the nirvana and the dream of us DAS providers. The challenge has always been, though, is that, as Chris and Matt alluded to, is that management, every time you make that change, it is not simple. You can't just simply take one sector today and move it and not have any issues with neighbor lists, with, X, Y, Z. And so, we really see, and we welcome SON, or the concepts of organizing or optimizing networks, so that we can really start looking at fully optimizing utilization, resource utilization, and that being spectral, being backhaul, being, power, you name it. But rather than have idle resources, being able to move that as the time of day or the traffic dictates, I think is very exciting.
And, actually, is that okay? Okay, we have two questions. There's one behind you. So, you go first. Everybody hear the question? E911, how do you adjust for E911?
Well, maybe I'll start and let you guys jump in. Earlier we were talking a little bit, and I guess I'd have to understand perhaps exactly what you need by resources. But really when I mentioned baseband pooling, and we were just trading some notes up here, there's some lingo out there, and people are using Cloud RAN. We don't typically use Cloud RAN because it has IT connotations and the like. But the difference between a baseband pool and a hotel is about physically putting baseband units in the same spot. When I refer to baseband pooling, and we're doing this today within even a single site or in conjunction with a DAS system, or in that example, geographically separated baseband units, what it means is that they are simply all working together as one, and so the processing can be shared. By doing that, you're also increasing your resiliency, but the understanding of that subscriber and where they're at in the network doesn't change. It's just you're getting a lot more efficient use of that underutilized baseband capacity.
Sure. No, I
Let
like
you
that
guys-
perspective. Thank you.
Sure.
It's like a walk down the aisle, just ask the question.
I know. I didn't see any $20 bills down there yet.
Oh, it's a check. It's a $20 check. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Art Meyerder, come with INA. I've got a question about the user experience. With this patchwork of intelligent distributed communications, I have no idea what this will connect to as I walk around. Where and how will the user experience be measured? Or is it going to be an application I buy and throw on the phone and then report back?
Good. Matt?
I couldn't hear his question
Oh.
clearly.
Basically, as we've got a lot of small cells, you're moving, the user is moving between different small cells. Where is the user experience measured and managed? Because the user is really not going to know, I'll say, where they are or what they're connected to. Yeah?
Exactly.
So where does user experience fit into all this? Where do you measure it? Anyone? You want to start?
I think the only place you can measure it is from the perspective of the user, because he's the ultimate critic.
And maybe I'll just tag on to that real quick. One is my 6-year-old boy downloaded Angry Boo, and for some reason I went through 3 gigabytes of data on my phone, so I don't know. But I'll just toss that out. Don't let your children download Angry Boo. But, the way we look at it, one of the products that goes along with this concept of having a unified network management system is the insight we call Traffica, but the ability to see that actual end user experience and be able to look into the packets that are done. And so we did that for the Republican, Democratic National Conventions and the Super Bowl and the like. And what it allows us to do is on a site at any given time see the exact experience by each user and adjust the capacity accordingly. So there's a lot of tools like that, and carriers deploy probes and so forth, and this is a little different approach to doing that. But there are those type of tools so that the carrier in their dashboard can see what that experience might be, and it actually turns out those triggers then can be applied to SON so it can automate the capacity to help it out.
Yeah, my point would be, though, that a lot of times the carrier will have no idea. I could be suddenly on Wi-Fi and using an alternate voice or video package, and the carrier will have no idea what I'm doing because I'm off their network completely. I may not even know that, especially an uninformed user. And in that case, we could have all sorts of different kinds of experiences depending on what path they take. And is it over a DAS because you can see what's happening over the DAS? Is it over a Pico, or is it over a Wi-Fi or whatever? There is no one single point or unifying management point to monitor all of these activities other than at the handset itself over here.
Okay, I got a very good question. So I was talking about Wi-Fi becoming one of the 5 fingers. There is a fast-tracked effort in the standards right now to address just that. I may have my acronym wrong, but ANDS is the standard to have a point of presence in your network, typically out at the EPDG, that will actually be able to help the carrier manage and still have visibility to you when you're on a Wi-Fi network. And even on our gateway today, if you have a client on your device, you can do that, and you can even have lawful intercept and run the control plane through the core of your network. So that everyone's working on that fast and furious. I'd say none of the solutions are really mature, but it's getting to that exact problem you said.
Okay, thank you.
One final point on that. We've done a lot of work on how people assess the quality of network, not billing and care and things. And a year ago, it was, number of bars is here, and data throughput is down here. 3 months ago, it's like this. We're actually doing the survey again in a few months. It's going to be like this. So the way people assess how good the connection is it's not just voice anymore. It is voice and data, and it is throughput as well as coverage. But your point, I've got 2 teenagers who sit upstairs on the Wi-Fi on their iPhones, and AT&T is quite happy with them because they're using Time Warner backhaul. And I've got a femtocell from Time Warner that we're all on as well. And but as soon as we hit that macro network, then AT&T sees us again. So we have a huge disconnect in terms of what the kids are doing. I know who they blame when it doesn't work, but I'm traveling right now, so they can't do anything about it. I think we have one more.
Yes, John George with OFS. Matt, in your opening comments, you made mention of a growth from 7 million to 70 million cell sites, and I just wanted to ask if you could give a little background to that comment, and then ask the others on the panel, where do you see the number of cell sites growing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay.
All right, well, the number I quoted was from mobile experts, and it's, there's a variety of market studies out there. I think there's another one from that shows that 2015 it'll be 40 million, and my personal belief is the majority of that's probably made up by the femtos. But I think the previous two questions just raised two issues about the complexity. I mean, the E911, about the ability, if you switch from one sector to inside a stadium to the parking, to cover the parking area, that has to be traceable back for E911, because there's different rules for in-building as there is for outdoor. The normal location-based measurements for out will apply for the parking area, but an address is sufficient today to apply for inside the stadium. The example of the user experience, being able to trace it. Okay, you can measure it from a user perspective, but then how do you use that information to figure out where the problems are is a complexity. So I look at this, I look at some of these statistics a little bit jaded. I think it's all going to happen, and the question is going to be is in the timing of when it's going to happen. And Qualcomm had put out a presentation that was pretty interesting. It went out and talked about past technology rollouts. And they show roughly about a 7-year maturity cycle that is from all the past technology rollouts, and about an 18-year lifespan for the technology. So we got to remember that we're just in the early stages of these technologies. And so these things are going to come over time. The question is, how quickly? I mean, when you read it, you think it's going to come tomorrow. I think they're going to come out tomorrow, and we're going to work out these bugs and these kinks, but it's not going to be able to live up to the hype next year or the year after. But it will eventually, and you have to deploy these things to be able to work them out. So do I believe those projections? I believe those projections. I just don't believe the timelines.
Tony?
Yeah, I agree with Matt. I think we're just looking at a change in how we're defining a cell site. So it used to be a big old tower, 100-foot tall, and it would blast away. So if you really start looking at work we're doing in stadiums or office buildings where, you're putting 16 sectors worth of capacity into a stadium, that's going to comprise multiple new cell sites. So if you just use that as a microcosm to really what's happening down at that level, down at the street level, where we go to hundreds of street level cell sites, if you will, to be that underlay to the macro, I can see the numbers adding up very quickly. So I think it's just really that redefinition of what a cell site is.
So since Matt mentioned one of my competitors, I can answer that question as well. They're wrong, by the way. No, the answer is it's really hard to know, because you're asking operators basically how much money you're going to spend on something they don't know how much it's going to cost, or how they're going to do the backhaul, or where they're going to put it, or what spectrum they're going to use for it, which is always difficult. The ratio we've always used is 10 to 20 to 1. So if you have one macro cell today, at some point in the future, the operator will have somewhere between 10 and 20 small cells per macro cell. So if you think about an operator in the US, a nationwide guy having, let's say, about 40,000 cells, they're going to end up somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 small cells. And that includes femtos, as well as obviously some DAS and all those types of things. Now, the problem is when you get down to, well, how many femtos, how many picos, how many metros, how much DAS, and the answer is yes. Somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000. And so it's a very difficult thing. And the funny thing is we do a lot of work with Wall Street, with vendors, and with the carriers. All three constituents are asking us how many small cells there are going to be. And it's like, well, the carriers should know because you're ordering them, and the vendors should know because you're building them, and Wall Street should know. Well, Wall Street doesn't know. But it's everybody's pointing to each other saying, yeah, well, you should know. And the reality is we're just going to see how the market develops. But those are the types of ratios that are being discussed right now. Not 3-to-1 or 5-to-1, but it starts at 10-to-1 and goes up from there. So, okay. I think we've got one more question, and we're probably out of time like that. Tracy's not giving me the, but I know she will soon. 5 minutes, okay.
Okay, great. My name's Tammy Cruz. I work for Verizon. My question's more about the backhaul. So you just made that point of how many small cells or DAS could be in the network, and you've got this trajectory of consumption going up, and the consumers aren't going to pay that same trajectory, and the cost of the network is difficult. So what do you see the evolution of backhaul for the operators, and how does that play into how successful small cell and the technology is?
Great question, because I'd written that one down as well. So who wants that?
I can start with one. We see that, as, again, if you look at a stadium as kind of a microcosm of what we expect, we see a tremendous amount of need for backhaul going in and out of these venues. Again, high capacity. You have to be able to backhaul that, if you will. So, what we really see is this now, maybe let's call it a front haul. A colleague of mine coined that many years ago. But if you really look at this baseband location where you can centralize and really optimize that traditional backhaul, we have methods in which we're using a lot of optical multiplexing to get the delivery from that to that stadium so that you're down to very few fiber strands. So, we really see a big increase in use of DWDM, higher order optical multiplexing. But, to toot the DAS horn again, that's a benefit of being able to pool to that single RAN where you can have your multiple operators, you can have your multiple baseband providers pool over that single RAN. Now we can aggregate into a single fiber optic bit stream and really optimize that front haul, if you will, or the back haul.
Okay. I'll just quickly tag on to that, maybe from a different perspective, because I think there'll also be some other innovations in the optical as you move towards the next generation optical access. But I think as this plays out with small cells, the whole concept behind that Flexi Zone product that I mentioned that we released is that it's a mesh backhaul. So you have, again, a centralized architecture with the baseband processing in one point, and the units speak to each other to get to address a backhaul challenge. And I think you're also seeing a lot of innovations in very small, compact microwave that can perhaps serve a pico, but it's a challenge.
Yep.
No, it's all wireless.
Yeah.
It's all wireless, and then you have one point where you do have your optical presence. So imagine an underlay in like we have it operating in Arlington Heights in Chicago, for instance. They're hanging on the street poles, they talk to each other, and then one point then is connected to the network via fiber optics.
So we actually have a new report out. We've done a report on backhaul. We're looking at microwave backhaul right now. And what's interesting is we've been talking to the operators in the last few weeks. And true story, one of them put some small cells through a downtown on street poles. Actually, they wanted permission to do it, and they built out a couple of street poles to show the nice little dipole with the antenna for the small cell on there, and it all looked very pretty and very nice. And they went to the planning committee to get permission to put it throughout the whole city, the downtown. But to do backhaul, they had to have microwave because not many street poles have fiber running to them. You may know this. So they put a little microwave antenna up there next to the dipole, and it looked like a little microwave antenna, right? And the planning committees, true story, saw the design and freaked out that they were going to be blasting microwave down all the streets and radiating children and things, and killed the whole thing. So the aesthetics here, it's crazy, but one of the small cells have major problems, like where do you put them, how do you power them, and then how do you get the backhaul out without radiating all the school children? And you laugh, but that's the perception of what we've got to deal with. You've got to be really careful on, if you're going to put a small cell on a light pole, it's got to look like a light pole, not like a microwave antenna, because you're going to scare people. So, we're about out of time, but I'm going to ask them. I've got one more thing. I'm going to ask each of the panels, and you get 30 seconds. And I mean 30 seconds, Chris. I know him real well, I can say this. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about this. Of all the things we talked about, what keeps you awake at night? What scares you the most that you think we're, as an industry, most unprepared for? And you can't answer, children, wives, mortgage, etc., but rather something professional like. As a final wrap-up, the slides I've got here with all these big long titles, if you give me a business card, I will shoot you the slides over to you, including all those numbers. So with that, thanks for your attention. So the last word goes to these three guys, and I think this time let's start with Matt. What scares you the most, Matt?
The OEMs. Besides that, it's really you hit on one of them. Is getting access to street furniture. I mean, access being power, backhaul, and site access. Because we talk about, it's hard enough right now, I think, in some of these outdoor DAS deployments, if you read the news on some of these cases with some of these municipalities, these city homeowners associations, just with the number of outdoor DAS nodes we have today and the amount of